On today's show, we bring up a couple of old debates. We talk about the supporting cast and some intel on the Cavaliers' first round draft pick. That's right, I've got a college basketball guy. John Fanta joins Locked On Cavs today. All that and more coming up on today's show.
You are Locked On Cavs, your daily Cleveland Cavaliers podcast.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. You can find the show wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, anywhere else. Also, make sure you check us out on YouTube. Just search Locked On Cavs on YouTube. Hit that thumbs up button if you're watching us right now. Make sure you hit subscribe and click that notification bell as well. Proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Hi again, everybody. I'm Danny Cunningham. You might know me from my time covering the Cleveland Cavaliers, places like 92.3 The Fan, Cleveland Magazine, and a number of other stops along the way. Today, a very special guest joining me, John Fanta, who, of course, does a fantastic job as a reporter and broadcaster for college basketball on Fox. Also the host of the Big East Shoot-Around, and most importantly is a diehard Cleveland fan. We're talking Cavaliers, Cleveland Browns, Cleveland Guardians. The man is a diehard with all of them. Of course, on today's Locked On Cavs, going to be focusing on the Cavs. And one of the things, John, that I wanted to dive into with you, and very much appreciate you coming on, is you were on 92.3 The Fan with myself and Ken Carmen a few weeks back, or a few months back at this point. And we talked about the Jarrett Allen pairing with Evan Mobley and the Darius Garland pairing with Donovan Mitchell. One of those you think can work, and it wasn't necessarily the one I expected. You think Mobley and Allen can work? Let's talk about why that is.
Well, Danny, I think that, and it's great to be with you, I think that Evan Mobley and Jarrett Allen can work more than I believe in Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell ever working for a top-tier East contender. Right now, the Cavaliers are a middle-of-the-pack Eastern Conference team. Now, if they're the best of the middle, I think that they are, right? I think that they are. I think that I would put Boston, I'd put the Knicks, I'd certainly have the 76ers, and then the Bucks are still above, on paper, in my opinion, above Cleveland, provided that all these teams stay healthy and whatnot. So for me, what I look at is this. The NBA is a bucket-getting, guard-to-wing type of league where you're going to have a primary ball handler, but then you've got to be able to find balance, and you do have to find complementary pieces in your front court, as we see from the likes of Denver with how Nikola Jokic plays. From my standpoint with Cleveland, Mitchell and Garland need the basketball in their hands to make the kind of impact they strive to make. And Darius Garland, in my opinion, is not the number 2 guard on a team that's trying to contend at the top of their conference. I think that he's a talented guard. I think he's a talented player. I think that he's a guy who, when adversity is hit, the responses to that have been varied, Danny. Now, there are circumstances there, but let's face it, there's a thought around the league that as a basketball player, you can out-physical him. You could back him down. You could put him in the ringer and make him have to work, and that's a bit of a problem for him because he's undersized. Donovan Mitchell is an elite scorer. Elite. And I think he's a great teammate and leader. Garland, his skill set is to try to do a lot of the things that Donovan's already doing. Whereas the Cavs made this coaching change with Kenny Atkinson because they believe they can unlock Evan Mobley. Now, will they? We'll see. But Atkinson is seconds into his remarks with any interview, with any press conference, when he says, I believe Evan Mobley can do this and this for our team. And look, there's an opportunity there with Mobley still being 23. Is the perimeter game, does that have rawness to it? Absolutely. But Danny, when you're 23 years of age, you've got a coach who knows how to develop players and who knows how to develop bigs and who just learned from the best in Steve Kerr. I am willing to bet on Mobley and Allen because I think Mobley is unselfish. I think that I think that Jarrett Allen is unselfish. I think that Jarrett Allen's great for a locker room. And I think there's a world where Evan Mobley can stretch the floor. And where Evan Mobley, by the way, you don't beat the Orlando Magic in that 7-game series. You don't beat them without Mobley. Mobley made multiple stops down the stretch in those games to win the Cavaliers those games. One game in particular at home in Cleveland when the series was even. And because
game 5, it was game 5. He was unbelievable down the stretch for as much as at times he left things to be desired offensively. Just defensively, he is the elite of the elite on that end already.
So it's a long answer. And, it might sound like I'm trying to make an argument, but my thought is, Danny, more to twist it here and get your reaction. It's more about the fact that I think there's just more square peg round hole with Mitchell and Garland being on the same team than there is if Mobley develops, and I'm betting on that a little bit more. I think I know the answer to Mitchell Garland. I don't know the answer fully yet to Mobley Allen.
I think that's fair. I do think that's fair, and I love how you explain that. Now, I think that there is more overlap in the skill set of Mitchell and Garland, as you mentioned, especially when you look back at what Donovan Mitchell looked like without Darius Garland this year, when Garland had that fractured jaw and missed 6 weeks, where one of the things I was most impressed about during that stretch, and yeah, you can say it was against a bad schedule at times, and it was, but the way that Donovan Mitchell handled himself as a facilitator, I don't think a younger version of Donovan Mitchell was going to be able to do that. I think he's grown into that player and been much better in that area. Now, I am willing to see what those two look like in a year, hopefully without a fractured jaw and, losing 15 pounds for Darius Garland and all that. The concern I have with the front court, because I think right now, Evan Mobley, maybe he doesn't have the highest ceiling anymore. Maybe that's Donovan Mitchell, because Donovan has gotten to a level I don't necessarily think I didn't think he was going to get to when the Cavs traded for him. I don't know if the Cavs thought he would get to this level where he's a guy that, his first year in Cleveland finished 6th in the MVP race. I just didn't know that he could reach that level, and I don't know that Evan Mobley can, but Evan Mobley's ceiling is so high, and I do wonder if he can reach that ceiling playing alongside another big. That is the biggest question I have there, is if he's not playing center for 70 to 75% of his minutes, can he reach that ceiling? And if Jarrett Allen is here, Jarrett Allen has to be playing center a lot, because it's not as if, in one of the situations I've brought up in the past has been that Lakers team that won the title, where Anthony Davis technically wasn't the center because they had Dwight Howard and they had JaVale McGee, and those guys could start games at center. But when push came to shove, Anthony Davis played center because those guys were role players, and if they sat on the bench in closing time, it didn't matter. It's harder to do that with Jarrett Allen because he's an all-star caliber player. So that's kind of where my concern comes in, is it's not that those guys aren't good. It's that, is Evan Mobley going to be able to spread his wings to the extent he needs to with the current configuration?
Well, and the current configuration is where what fires me up with this team. Because if you think that simply hiring a coach is the answer to your problems in a player-driven league, superstar-driven league, you are sorely mistaken. I think that there is a belief that J.B. Bickerstaff's offense was not good, which the system itself, Danny, was not good. All right, it was broken by the end of his tenure, and that's why he's no longer the coach of the Cavaliers. I think the Pistons made the right hire. I think JB's good at getting an organization back on track. We're trying to ascend here now in Cleveland. Kenny Atkinson, could he be the answer? Sure. But to put all this on him and to think the results are going to be all that different in a personnel, superstar-driven league, it's short-sighted. And here's my devil's advocate question to you, Danny. How much room does Darius Garland still have to grow? How much does he still have left to show that he hasn't shown us yet?
I think that's a fair question. I don't know that, obviously from last year, I think we could both agree he can be a much better player than the guy that was on the floor last year. He's shown he can be an all-star caliber player. I don't think he's a perennial all-star player, but I think he's a guy that, if he makes 2 all-star teams in his career, that's probably about right for his skill set. He's a really good player, and I do think that he, like Evan, probably won't get to his complete ceiling playing alongside in Darius's case, and it's different in Evan's case because Evan is the higher ceiling player. Evan is the better player amongst him and Jarrett Allen just long term, where you can't say that about Darius Garland, where Donovan Mitchell is the higher ceiling player. Donovan Mitchell is better now. Like, all of that is Donovan Mitchell. So for whatever his ceiling is, I don't know that he can necessarily reach that alongside Donovan. I do think I'm a little bit higher on them as a pairing than you are, but the one thing that I need to see so much more out of him, he needs to be so much better in terms of making decisions. He needs to make those decisions quicker. And I think the other thing, he needs to take more catch and shoot three opportunities. Like, that is something that if it's going to work, he does have to change his game to some extent. And I'm not positive he's going to do that.
Yeah, that's it. You know, there's going to be a change in principles in Cleveland when you have a new coach. And there's got to be a change in how you think and how you play. You know, look, behind the scenes, I think that, well, we saw it in the Athletic reporting, but Danny, you're, no pun intended, locked in on the Cavaliers as well. And I've got, you know, some people around the Cleveland organization and people that cover the team that, you know, you check in on in the middle of last year. And even before before the postseason, you could kind of sense, I'm going to use the word apathy, and I'm going to use the word a little bit outplayed. That even though they beat the Magic, it felt like there was just this hovering sense of, all right, it's time for some adapting to happen. You know, but I think that's where I'm kind of wrestling internally here, Danny, because in the NBA, it feels like standing pat does not really work. Now, the Cavs didn't stand pat with their coach, and you give them credit for recognizing the writing on the wall and making a change that I don't think was easy for them to make, because I do think that they genuinely like J.B. Bickerstaff, the higher-ups did, and it just didn't end well. But I think for them, you know, I went into this offseason, and you look at this, what the 76ers did in getting Paul George. You look at what the Knicks did the night before the draft in reeling in Mikal Bridges. And you sit here and you say, how did the Cavaliers significantly upgrade their roster? And the answer is they didn't.
And that's not an answer you want to hear. I do want to talk about, coming up, the effects Kenny Atkinson could have, what this roster needs to do differently, how this roster could look different maybe in 6 months or so, a little bit before the trade deadline, or I guess 5 months at this point before the trade deadline arrives. So we'll talk about that next right here on Locked On Cavs. Today's show is brought to you by BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a fantastic option if you are looking to start your journey on therapy, because sometimes your schedule might be packed. You've got kids' activities going on, big projects with work, and it's so easy to let your priorities slip, and you start stopping thinking about yourself, and that's not the right thing to do. So even when we know what makes us happy, it can be hard to make time for it. And when you feel like you don't have any time left for yourself, non-negotiables like therapy, those become more important than ever before. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It is entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Those are all important things, because your life might be moving 1,000 miles an hour, and you might not have time for conventional scheduling options. Well, BetterHelp is flexible and on your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire, get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. It can be difficult to find a therapist that works for you, so being able to switch therapists without an additional charge is a great option that BetterHelp has. So never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA and you can get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. Thank you again for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. So, John, one of the things that we've talked about briefly was the Cavs relieving JB Bickerstaff of his head coaching duties following the second round loss to the Boston Celtics in 5 games last spring, hiring Kenny Atkinson. You've touched upon the offense for JB Bickerstaff, that system just being broken, not what it needs to be in the NBA. Could not agree more with that. I do think, and as you mentioned, the Pistons hired Bickerstaff. I think that is an awesome hire for them. He will do great things there. I think Kenny Atkinson was needed. I think it might be a little bit unfair to expect Kenny Atkinson to totally revamp what is a roster that hasn't changed, with the exception of one guy on a 2-way contract and Jaylon Tyson, who was the number 20 overall pick. But what do you think from a basketball standpoint, before we get into the collection of role players on the bench, what do you think Kenny Atkinson can change that could advance the Cavs forward?
Well, he's got to change Evan Mobley's shot economy. First and foremost, the shot volume's got to be greater, and I think it will be. I think Atkinson will be aggressive with Mobley, because either the Cavaliers are going to get good answers on Mobley or they're going to try some different things with him, and it's not going to happen. But Atkinson has a successful track record of developing players. He really does. Now, he's got to come in here and he's got to say, okay, Donovan and Darius, here's what you both do well. Here's how I need to make you play better off one another. And, Donovan is a guy who I think is going to take – he always has taken coaching. He's a hard worker. He's a Rick Pitino guy. He's going to come in. He wants to win. He wants to win playoff series. He doesn't want his rep to be that he was this regular season player who never climbed the mountain, and couldn't win in the playoffs. He doesn't want to be a Phillip Rivers. I didn't think that we had that on your bingo card.
No, I did not, but I'm glad you brought that up. He's not been out of the second round, and I think he is somebody, and I don't like speaking for players in this aspect, but he's made a lot of money in his career, and I think winning is something that is of the utmost importance to Donovan Mitchell now. I don't think it's necessarily, and of course, he just signed a massive contract extension this summer, but I think the winning is the thing that matters, not necessarily what his paychecks are going to look like every 2 weeks.
Yeah, I think the other thing is this. You've got Karis LeVert, you've got Max Strus, and you've got Dean Wade. But I think when you look at the core, Danny, sometimes it felt like this past year the Cavs are saying, we got to shoot more threes. We got to make more threes. We got perimeter help. This was what ruined us against the Knicks in that first round playoff series, in which it was a reality check. I think that as opposed to just volume, quality of shot, creating better shots against Orlando's defense, and then against Boston, the Cavs weren't doing a good enough job moving the ball and creating high percentage shots for their supporting cast members. Great NBA teams are able to shot economize better than what the Cavaliers were doing. So, look, when your supporting cast doesn't significantly get better on paper, you got to find a way to play those guys differently. I thought Max Strus pressed this past year at times, pressed more than he did in other times in his career. There's got to be something. If I'm Kenny Atkinson, I pull up Eric Spoelstra tape of some of Strus's best games. I think the Cavs with Strus, I think the Cavs thought, we'll plug and play Strus and he'll be that guy. But Danny, he went through some major shooting slumps for this team. 3 for 10 in the elimination game against Boston, in which he shot 7 threes. He did make 3 of them, but it never felt like, from a shot-making perspective in the playoffs, that Strus could be heavily relied upon. And let's face it, they need him to be. Like, Max Strus has to be an important part of what this team does offensively.
You're right, and I do wonder how much of that is. I think he can be at times, at least this past year, and I don't know how this is going to necessarily change considering the roster is for the most part the same. I think he's been a little bit out of position. Like, he is, 6'4", 6'5". He's undersized to be a 3 in the NBA. There's no doubt about that. But that's sort of the role the Cavs have him in. They don't have this roster. The biggest flaw with this roster, I actually don't think is the Mobley or Allen thing, having too much of that, or Garland or Mitchell. It's that they don't have a ton of stuff in between in terms of size. And Dean Wade, for as much as I like Dean Wade, he's a good basketball player. He's a good defender. He can make shots. But him being really the only guy his size makes him so irreplaceable. And to me, that's the biggest flaw in the way this roster is built.
Yeah, that's a great point. That is the point here. And it feels like within that supporting cast, you have a lot of guys, or not a lot, but you have some guys who, like a Dean Wade Strus type of thing, where it feels like guys are there to do a similar thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's not enough differentiation on this roster. And, I think of Boston, right? And how they won a championship. Their role allocation was elite. And they don't win a championship without Drew Holiday and Derek White doing the amount that both those guys did in their roles, and guys that were, frankly, the Cavs don't have as the third and fourth type of guys on a team. But yeah, it also feels like, Danny, and tell me if I'm wrong, but that you're expecting some of this stuff from these supporting cast members that, frankly, it's almost unfair to expect it, because it's just on paper it's not at that level. It's not at that level of a top 3 team in the Eastern Conference on paper. Not saying that Kenny can't pull that out of them, but we have to analyze what this roster is personnel-wise. And personnel-wise right now, barring some massive surprise, it feels like it's just kind of missing the boat.
It is, to an extent, because of how the talent on the roster is allocated. And I don't disagree with you about some of those expectations are unfair, especially when you compare them to Boston, to where, and I understand Boston is the extreme here, because you look at their 2 best role players are Olympic gold medalists for Team USA and Derek White and Drew Holiday. A guy in Kristaps Porzingis who they really didn't need to actually win a championship. He's anywhere from their 3rd to 5th best player. Like, he's also an all-star player when he's healthy. And there's the roster for the Cavs is so far away from that other kind of roster to where they've got role players that are all-star caliber role players. The Cavs don't have that right now. And to be fair, too, no one else really does. And that is kind of, how are you going to find ways to close that gap is a huge question I have, just because I don't necessarily see the avenue for it.
Yeah, that's the bigger thing is you're sitting there. Well, I think the Cavs are saying the avenue for it is their new head coach. But
which I do think that can be something that maybe closes the gap a little bit, but expecting it to be the entire thing, that's not going to happen. That's never going to happen in the NBA. It's in the NBA, the coach can always be part of the problem. The coach can always be part of the solution.
Yes.
The coach is never the entire problem and is never the entire solution.
Exactly. Whereas, like, in the NFL, it can be, the coach can be the entire problem, or can be a big part of the solution. But the coach can be an entire problem in that league. In baseball, we don't see that. It's a decisions game. Players got to play. But in basketball, especially in the NBA, look, I think what's interesting about this is the Cavs have one of the best pure scorers in the NBA.
Mm-hmm.
They really do. Donovan is that good of a scorer. He is that good of a player. He really is. And it's a huge win for the Cavs that they're able to get him to an extension. Remember when he first comes in, and let's face it, the national media, even, I'm out here in the New York area, everyone's like, oh, he'll be a Knick in no time. He'll be out here. Well, look how that ended up. So it's a huge credit to the Cavs that they're able to keep somebody, and that they're able to keep somebody that they can build with. But it just feels like, to have a player of this quality and to not be exploring some new ways personnel-wise to win with him when you have underperformed the last 2 years, right? The expectations heading into this past year were higher than to go to a 7th game with Orlando.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of, tank the end of your regular season to avoid people. The expectation going into the season was they could play anybody, and they'll be ready to face anybody, and they'll be tough, and they'll have learned from their first encounter. And right now, you sit here and you say, is this organization significantly better off than they were at this time a year ago?
I think they are better off significantly. I don't know. I think they're in a better spot now than they were 12 months ago, particularly because they don't have the question of Donovan Mitchell's future hanging over their heads. And I do think that is something that can have effect in these locker rooms where there is uncertainty. And ultimately, before we move on to Jaylon Tyson here, the best thing that happened to the Cavs this offseason was Donovan Mitchell, Jarrett Allen, and Evan Mobley all through their actions said, we want to spend the best years of our career in Cleveland. And what happens after that, we don't yet know, but that is something that I think that was by far the biggest and best thing that could have happened for them this offseason. Truly do.
Well said. Couldn't agree more.
I want to talk Jaylon Tyson because you know Jaylon Tyson better than I know Jaylon Tyson as somebody who calls college basketball on Fox. We're going to do that next right here on Locked On Cavs. Today's show also brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is my go-to place when I'm looking for tickets. Cleveland Guardians, when they're in town, if I want to go to a game, where do I go? Game Time, the place to go. The Guardians had a doubleheader against Kansas City yesterday. They've got 2 more games left in that 4-game set with the Royals. Maybe you want to head on over to Progressive Field, check out one of those 2 games. Game Time is the place to go if you're going to do that. One of the things that I love about the Game Time app is that they will show you what your view of the field, or, if it's basketball season, the court or the rink or, the football field, they will show you what your view will look like from the seat you were looking at buying. That is what I think one of their best features. Also, they've got all-in pricing. You can go in the app and say, hey, I don't want to be surprised at the last minute. I want to see on this ticket before I buy exactly what it's going to cost before I go through, I want to go to checkout now. You can toggle that on. They've got all in prices, so no surprises, no last minute hiccups. They take the guesswork out of buying tickets. So download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. So, John, this year, the Cavs, as we've talked about, have not made very many additions to the roster. They have agreed to terms with JT Thor on a 2-way deal, which probably not going to spend any time talking about that. They also drafted Jaylon Tyson out of Cal with the number 20 overall selection. You, as somebody who covers college basketball for a living and does great work on Fox, what did you think of that pick with number 20 overall?
Well, it was a bold pick, but in this draft class, this is a draft class where you could absolutely take shots. Normally you can anytime that you're right around 20. But in this draft class, which was one of the weaker draft classes on paper in recent memory, the Cavs had an open door at 20, and Jacoby Walter was off the board, and Dalton Knecht was off the board at 17. And if he's still around at 20, I think he comes away as a Cavalier. But for me, it's not as if the Cavaliers made this pick and really, really missed on someone. Terrence Shannon Jr. is a guy who I was enthralled by, but he didn't end up going until 27 to the Minnesota Timberwolves, and obviously had some legal issues there at Illinois, which he was found not guilty of, and everything got thrown away, and good for him. But I think at 20 for the Cavs, Danny, they were in a position where they could take a bit of a swing, and because of the nature of the board, Jaylon Tyson is a really big swing. And a guy that if it doesn't work out, didn't work out. But a guy that if it does work out, becomes a steal. And I think that there's steal value here. I think Jaylon Tyson can be a steal for the Cavaliers. Look, guys that average around 26 to 7 and 4 per game do not grow on trees. I don't care where you're playing college basketball. And he was playing in a high major league at Cal. For Mark Madsen, NBA coaching line there. The Mad Dog, who I've gotten to talk with a couple times. I know you and Ken Carmen over at the Fan had talked with him at one point on an interview and had discussed his game. Mark Madsen's a guy who came in and really revolutionized Jaylon Tyson's game to be NBA ready. Here's the thing about Tyson. There's lots to like here. 6'6", 215. He's got the length factor. He's got the scoring factor. I mean, in the last 7 games of his college career alone, he goes for at least 18 points on 4 occasions. So had a couple of 25-plus point games along the way. He was a really productive player his last year of college and had a multifaceted toolbox of skills. I like the pick. And obviously in Summer League, he showed some of that skill set, some of that dynamic. But for the Cavaliers, they could use more perimeter help. They could use more creativity help there. And this is a guy who can score the ball at a high level. So when the pick was first made, my eyebrows raised because I thought it was, on many boards that was a bit of a reach. But then you understand why the Cavs did it. And it makes sense for where they are as an organization. And I like the pick.
So one of the things that I've grown to love about Tyson as a player is that he played, and this is going to sound so weird as I say it, but for the most part, he played an entirely different position in college than he's going to in the NBA because that Cal team didn't have a ton of talent. And as you mentioned, playing in the Pac-12, may it rest in peace. Playing in that league, there was a lot of really good basketball in that league. And that Cal team, on most nights, for the most part, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but they were overmatched playing against some of those other opponents. Tyson was, for the most part, playing point guard. Now, we know in Cleveland, Darius Garland's here, Donovan Mitchell is here, even to some extent, Karis LeVert is here, Craig Porter Jr. is here. Jaylon Tyson's not going to be playing point guard, at least not right away. But the fact that he's going to enter the NBA with at least secondary playmaking skills is something that I do think is going to make him be able to stick early on. The other thing I love about him is we talked about not having somebody Dean Wade's size other than Dean Wade, and Jaylon Tyson is a little bit smaller than him. But one of the biggest issues the Cavs have had from a role player point of view is they've not rebounded well on the wings. Think back to that Knicks series a couple of years ago. It wasn't necessarily that Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley weren't rebounding. It was that nobody else was. And Josh Hart, who's 6'3", 6'4" on the Knicks, was getting 12 rebounds a game because the Cavs didn't have wings that could rebound. Jaylon Tyson is that guy. Like, I do think there's a world where he could be a little bit of a taller version of Josh Hart, and that could be a huge win for the Cavs too.
That's a great point. And you are absolutely right in that the Cavaliers, let's face it, have been soft at the wing position. They've been soft at that position as a rebounding team. They've had shooters, but Danny, you and I both know you got to have more than that. And Josh Hart, a guy like that's a dog that can exploit you. The Celtics have those types of guys. Even the Sixers have those types of guys. Look, this is to me, it's a low risk, right? And a potentially high reward type of pick. I think that when you look at Jaylon and you look at what he went through, you're right. He was on a Cal team that was overmatched and that wasn't particularly good in the Pac-12, but did have a couple of moments this past year where they showed some signs. And I think Mark Madsen will tell you as he's building his Cal program that he doesn't get through year one without a guy as good as Jaylon Tyson to lay the foundation. So Jaylon's been a part of it. He's gone through the wars. He's gone through the tough times, and he learned as a result what it means to play his role and to lead. Like he was Cal's leader. When they stepped on the floor and they were going to be overmatched, he was at the top of every scouting report and still was a guy who had several 20-plus point performances, not to mention 6 to 8 assists, 6 to 8 rebounds. He's got experience doing a little bit of everything. So for me, I'm with you. I think that this pick can absolutely pan out. And I think that we have to temper expectations with any draft pick. But I do like the idea of him being a guy who can rebound at a high level, who can handle the ball at a capable level. And most importantly, Danny, when you're on the floor in his role, you got to score. Yeah. And the Cavaliers believe in him as a complementary scorer to their group. I think it addressed a need. And I think there's a chance that with how much he showed us this past year he didn't just play on like a great mid-major team. Okay. This isn't, this isn't a situation where we're talking about a guy like a Dylan Windler. This is a guy who played at high major basketball and was the best player on a team that, like you said, was outmatched, but still performed at a very versatile level.
It is, I think when you're picking at 20, it is kind of a crapshoot, especially in this draft. Everyone gets so NFL draft crazy, and if you're picking at 20, you should find a starter, and the NBA just does not work like that, where sometimes you're picking at 12, and if you get a role player, that's a great pick for you there. So I am very curious how this is going to play out when ultimately he does get his shoes on the floor this fall when basketball season arrives. But John, thank you so much for doing this. This was an absolute blast. Everyone, make sure you go find John on Twitter at John_Fanta. Does fantastic work covering college basketball for Fox. Also check him out at Field of 68. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Danny, anytime. Great to join you on Locked On Cavs and all those Cavs followers out there. Appreciate you guys as well when you chime in. Pleasure to join you, my friend.
Thank you again for making Locked On Cavs your first listen every day. You can check out the show wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, anywhere else. Make sure you check us out on YouTube too. Just search Locked On Cavs.